Hey guys, it's Tyler. How many times have you sat down or heard somebody else sit down to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons on the basis of either of these two things? More things, but I'll narrow it down to two. It's like you're playing through, Tolkien's Fellowship, and you can play these fantastical characters, and they both fulfill a kind of role in the Fellowship. You got like a dwarf, like Gimli, or all these things, and yeah, it's kind of like that. All right, cool, okay. Or it's like a board game, but other than the rules that are set in stone in the game, you're really limited only by your imagination, and you can just come up with stuff on the fly. And it's not just a choose your own adventure game, because they don't use those words. They say you're limited only by your imagination. And then you, or the person that's telling you the story about how tabletop RPGs aren't really their thing, sit down and go, well, none of that happened. I was either railroaded by my GM, which is a problem, but it's a separate problem, or the game just doesn't support doing anything it told you it could do. Let me explain. D&D has an issue with branding. And this has kind of run away from itself, which is the D&D of yore used to kind of say that it was Tolkien-esque, and it still wasn't very Tolkien-esque back then, except for superficial elements like, yeah, it's got some of his races, except orcs don't work at all how they did in Tolkien's fantasy. All right. It's got, dwarves and elves and stuff, except, of course, elves, and they have wildly different abilities than the dwarves and elves did in Tolkien's fantasy. And there's the politics of the world are way different. We could get into that all day. Oh, especially the magic is literally Vancian magic. It was always a pulp fantasy game from the get-go. But the farther and farther we've gotten through the editions, which Max points out is stupid because that's not how an edition in publishing works. It's only how an edition in tabletop games work now. I don't know why they started doing that. It has gotten yet further and further removed from, what little it had to do with Tolkien and what a lot it had to do with pulp fantasy. When in any of Tolkien's works did we see a magician, some of the most powerful figures, do a first edition D&D thing of casting a magic missile that does like a D4 or D6 damage, and then when they're out, they cower behind the fighter because they have no martial skills, and they just sort of stand there. That didn't happen because they didn't run out of spells, and they were good at martial combat, at least to some extent. Not a very Tolkien-esque magic system at all. It's much more pulpy, much more low power level, low fantasy, at least in the early levels, quite a few of those early levels, in fact, of early Dungeons & Dragons, let's say before 3rd edition. The gods also playing a very major role walking the earth, and there being multiple of them, much more similar to Conan the Barbarian and other Robert E. Howard's works. The geopolitics, that sort of stuff, the grid maps, is all much more similar to wargaming, which they took abject influence from with Gary Gygax and company writing in several wargaming magazines. Chainmail initially really just being a war game with that you controlled one or a few characters in, and Armor Class coming from naval wargaming, one being ripped almost 1-to-1, which is part of why there are some nonsensical issues with that. And then later we get a huge swing in the opposite direction towards super high fantasy. Characters at very low level can do things that you would have to be at like level 10 or something in first edition Dungeons and Dragons to do. Some of the max level spells in early Dungeons and Dragons are laughable to us today because not just the numbers, but like the abilities, like, turning a stick to snakes is like a 5th level spell or something like that. Meanwhile, in modern editions of Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, you snap your finger and you can teleport, so it's yeah, so Dungeons and Dragons, it's not pulp fantasy anymore. It's too powerful. It's not Tolkien-esque fantasy, and it never really has been, because now the martial characters are too powerful, and they have way more access to magic, not just through magical items, which is, of course, vaguely Tolkien-esque, but also through just abilities and class specialization and multi-classing, things like this. So the identity of Dungeons and Dragons now is Dungeons and Dragons. It's its own beast. People who've been playing it for a long time understand this, I think. Unless they've only played one edition, which is often how the edition wars start. But there's an issue with getting people to play the game. And I don't even just mean from a role-playing aspect, though that's part of the problem, is things are pretty constricted. If you read through any module, there will be a lot of, if your players get too clever, here's how you can get them back on the track, and yep, they're telling you to railroad. So they're telling your players to use their imagination, and then they're either objectively, overtly punishing your players for using their imagination. See Tomb of Horrors, see tons of the early modules, which will just send you immediate death, no save, or cripple your character, or send you to a lower level of the dungeon, and it's just horrifically unplayable if you didn't either guess exactly what the writer wanted you to do, or you started doing something the writer of the dungeon didn't want you to do. In that way, you're quite limited by not your imagination, but by the whims of Game Master Fiat, which you'll always be limited to some extent because of Rule Zero and the GM's role as adjudicator, and the game itself and the way that things are written. So there's flavor issues, and of course we could go on and on about how modern D&D just doesn't understand their own fiction at all, with what's been done with orcs, with what's been done with the half races, with the lack of ability to make interesting connections between the mundane and the magical. The magical doesn't feel very magical in D&D because everyone has access to it to some extent. The lack of a skill system. The skill system is the most annoying mechanical part of the games to me, because it just keeps changing every edition when, in my opinion, of course, 3.0, 3.5, they fixed the problem by having a robust skill system that all use the same dice. Early D&D, mixing it up with, we'll use percentile for this and then D20 for this, and it just felt like the choices were so random. They unified the system in 3.0. They gave you a lot of skills. You were rolling skills very often. You had meaningful non-combat interactions that you could have with your character. Whereas now, what can I do outside of combat? It does start looking a lot more like a war game, again, by 4th, 5th edition. Starts looking very video gamey with the cooldown on abilities, the short rest mechanic, the long rest mechanics. The edition wars, I think, happen not just because people latch on to the first system they play and that's what they like, but also because you like the first system you play, and then the system that comes after that it's totally incomprehensible. It has nothing to do with what came before it. I've run a lot of earlier editions and other games entirely, but earlier editions in particular for this comparison, for people who have only ever played 5th edition. And they always have the same reaction, which is the skills system in this is way better. It's way easier to die. It's way easier to kill other things. Combat's way faster. Even if they say, I still want to keep playing 5th edition, they raise questions as to how the game could have been so much different a mere 5 years prior. Well, when the game released 2 seconds ago, right? It's really confusing, and I don't know if having such a stratified, broken up community is good for long-term sales. Is it good for the short-term sales? Sure. But they have, Phil, as somebody who's been a playtester for Wizards of the Coast, they have long complained about new player retention. How do you retain a new player when you're not just your branding, but what people say about your game doesn't match your first time experience playing it? And how do you keep the old timers when there's a lot of fantastic OSR, just lots of old supplements? This is one of my biggest issues with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I've got 12 years of content for the first game. Even if a lot of it's not great, I could throw out half of it and still have like 100 books of content for it. So you're not bringing on the old players unless you've got some seriously major improvements. New players, they don't have any loyalty to your game yet, so unless you've won them over right away, and you probably haven't if you're lying to them, misleading them, let's say that, then they'll just move on to another game really quickly. That's the majority of the success that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has seen. It does a lot of things that 5th Edition Dungeons & Dragons does, but in better ways, at least for the kinds of people that want to play that type of game. To close, I don't know if I have a solution for Wizards of the Coast. You might could bring back something like what Hearthstone has done, and bring a Hearthstone Classic, which just has the first expansion, and that's it, for the people that enjoyed Hearthstone the way it launched. Almost 10 years ago now, right? Yeah, no, 10 years ago. Wow, it's been some time. And launch a Dungeons & Dragons Classic, or like a Forever 5e, if you want some alliteration, for those people that love 5th edition and refuse to play anything else. Then you could bring up, because you've already brought up the getting rid of the editions thing, which I'm not entirely against, but instead of having the frankly despotic name 1D&D, call it something like well, D&D Next wasn't a bad working title, I didn't think. Give clear ideas as to what it is we're actually getting. And I don't think we're going to get that when we have CEOs and CFOs that have Magic the Gathering pulled up on their laptops in board meetings because they don't know anything about the company they're working for. Well, let me know if you have any ideas, thoughts that differ than mine. I'm sure there are examples of D&D being more Tolkien-esque, having more freeform stuff than I know. There is so much content out there, and I'm a lot younger than a lot of you guys. I've read through a lot of the stuff because I think it's really cool, but I am by no means a D&D historian, wealth of knowledge. So, yeah, let me know if you agree with anything I said. I don't know if I really have any advice that's to fix anything in this video. It's just some musing, a little video response on, a couple of things that have been going on recently. Thanks for your comments, K-Dolo. Thanks, as always, for the great videos, Max and Phil. And thanks for all your comments in the description below. I'll see you guys.